Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenters, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box. You can enter those anytime you feel comfortable, but do know that we hold those until the end, and oftentimes it's not possible for us to get to all the questions. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet posted in the chat box shortly. And if you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, the link will also be in the chat box, but near the end of the talk. Keep your eye on the chat box then. Bookmark the link if you're not going to open it before the webinar ends, and also make sure you save your certificate after completing the continuing education survey because we don't have access to those certificates after the fact. If you missed last week's talk in the series, my discussion of focusing on task-relevant info in forensic evaluations is now available on our YouTube channel. The recording for this week's talk should also be available on our YouTube channel later this week, and the PowerPoint slides will be accessible for people that registered for the series later this week as well. As a heads up, next week we have Dr. David Shapiro, who will be covering some commonly asked questions about forensic mental health practice. But circling back to this week, I'm excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be discussing APA professional practice guidelines for working with trauma survivors in clinical and forensic settings. This is Dr. Lenore Walker. Dr. Lenore Walker was a longtime elected member of APA Council of Representatives and other government positions, and she was selected by the APA Practice Division to chair the development of the first professional practice guidelines on PTSD and trauma-related disorders. Her research and clinical intervention with battered women that named battered women syndrome and other survivors of interpersonal trauma has been published in numerous peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and books. She's given keynote addresses and training workshops internationally, and among other honors, she was awarded the 2023 Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology. She's now a professor emeritus from Nova Southeastern University, and she continues to provide forensic services in her independent practice. She's testified in legal cases around the world, providing information about the psychological impact from trauma to assist judges and juries in various types of cases. Her favorite activity these days is writing mystery novels based on her forensic practice that can be found on Amazon. I see the wonderful sunny backdrop here. I hope you are in a safe place these days, Dr. Walker. And on behalf of the University of New Mexico, we're very excited for you joining our series and thankful that you'll be sharing your expertise with us today. I'll go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Yes, we are expecting a hurricane here, but so far it's really sunny and you know, all this hoopla about a hurricane coming. I'm so glad we're doing this today and not tomorrow because that's when it's supposed to come. So let me start by saying I'm really pleased to be able to share with you the first professional practice guidelines that we have developed for APA. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. So I think you have to do it this way. No. Let's see if we can get it up. There we go. Okay. And we'll put it on slideshow. Got it.
Boom. There we go.
Okay. So let me first share with you just the group that work with me. These, although I was the chair of this group, I had a wonderful group of trauma specialists. You may know some of them: David Baldwin, Becca Bradley, Amelia Davis, Julian Ford, Melissa Ming Foynes, and Rahini Gupta, and Naila Hamdi, who will work with me. With Mary Hardiman was our staff person, and we worked for 6 years on these guidelines. So I have to say, I wasn't a fan of guidelines until I started working on them. and realize that they are useful. They have their use, and I'm going to tell you what I think these are particularly useful for today. I'm not going to read all of this. Anthony just told you about all the things you have to do to sign in and out and get your CE certificates. And I don't have any financial arrangements that are related to this particular disclosure. APA, we're all our work in APA is volunteer. So that's just a disclosure we have to do. And there's my views, even though APA has published these key concept guidelines. What I'm going to share with you today about them is my view. And here are our objectives. Hopefully, by the end of this hour, you're going to be able to differentiate between clinical professional guidelines, and ethical standards. The second objective is that you're going to understand the 6 areas we chose and the 17 guidelines that we put forward. And the third objective is that you understand what the rationale and application are, particularly for the legal frameworks, because this is a law and mental health presentation. So even though guidelines, all the guidelines that APA puts forward are intended to provide a scientific framework for all practicing and for all applied psychologists, we still have to understand the culture in which the patient or client lives and works. And we have to modify what we do to understand that culture. And sometimes science and culture don't match. So we have to really understand that, especially in doing guidelines, because in order to prepare these guidelines, we have to go through all kinds of scientific literature that we find. We also went through all the cultural stuff. And I'll tell you more about how we did that. One of the things is that when you talk about trauma, there's so much information that is on social media these days. Some of it is scientific, and some of it is cultural, and some of it we have no idea where it comes from. So we have to be able, as psychologists working with people, to sort through a lot of that. And that's a different standard than it has been previously. Because in so many times, all they did was look at articles that are published in journals. Not that that's not good, but it's not enough, especially when you're working in an area such as trauma. So APA puts forward guidelines that are best practices. They are not intended to be ethical standards, and they are not enforceable by APA or by the ethics code. Sometimes guidelines are put into the regulatory framework in the different states. So you do have to be careful of that. And when we prepare guidelines, we prepare them knowing that that might happen. And if you notice the statements in the guidelines themselves, never say you shall do something, but rather they say psychologists strive to do this. Psychologists, I forget all the words. They were like about 10 words that we would use instead of saying you will or you shall, which is enforceable under the law, but rather think about it. This is why we consider it best practices, but not always, you can't always do it that way. In my legal work, I'm always prepared to be able to say if I don't follow a guideline, and let's say I'm on cross-examination and the attorney on the other side wants to know why I didn't follow the guideline, I usually have a rationale for why I didn't follow it. And I make it clear that you don't have to, it's not mandatory to follow it. We'd like to be able to do it, but we can't always. And so that's a really important difference between guidelines and ethical standards. Now, clinical guidelines are different from professional practice guidelines. The difference is that the clinical guidelines actually looked at all the research on how you treat different clinical disorders. The professional practice guidelines looked at what is the scientific framework for setting up your practice and working with your patients. What do you have to know? And what kinds of things are important to think about when you're working with patients or with clients? We added some guidelines that would be effective for people who are applied psychologists, because we know forensic psychologists also come under the rubric of applied psychology as well as under clinical psychology. So we tried to make room for both of that in these professional practice guidelines, especially with trauma from workplace violence. So what happened in 2017 was that when I was a member of Council of Representatives at that time, the uh, working group that put together the clinical guidelines for working with trauma was very controversial on council floor when they presented it to council for ratification, for a vote of approval, because they were only dealing with, or mostly dealing with, those kinds of research um, research guidelines that were with random controlled trials efficacy of disorders. And many people who were working with trauma, who were right there in the audience, said, "Wait a second, I do my treatment from a more psychoanalytic approach, or I do it from a more not a CBT approach, which is where, or a DBT approach, where many of the research articles were, and you're not allowing for my work, and my work is successful. At least my patients say it's successful." And so it was quite a debate on council floor. And the compromise was, if we approve the ones that were there, because there wasn't anything wrong with the ones that were there, they just weren't enough, then we will do some professional practice guidelines in addition, that don't have to be that kind of strict scientific research. And so we agreed, the council, which is like, for those of you who are involved in APA and not on council, there's like, come see us sometime during APA meetings. There's like 175 people debating an issue. So you can imagine what discussion is like on council floor. So I was asked at that point um, uh, uh, by the practice directorate, because professional practice guidelines and clinical guidelines are put forward by the APA practice directorate. Now, the education directorate does produce some of their own guidelines, and I suspect the new applied psychology directorate is going to be able to do some of their own guidelines as well. So those of you who are in forensics may find yourself with guidelines from more than one APA group. But these are from the practice directorate, and they have a very specific way of doing guidelines. And that's part of why it took us so long, because we not only had to review all the literature, which was a lot of literature out there on the professional role working with patients, but we also had to write it in the way I suggested, that it's not enforceable, but rather it's a best practices approach. So what did we do? Well, the first thing we did was we tried to define, what are we talking about trauma? And we decided that it wasn't enough to simply use PTSD, that although that certainly is the most well-known form of trauma, there are different forms of trauma. Um, and we took the SAMHSA definition And this is just a kind of a simplification of the definition that Samsha uses. But it basically is when an event or events overwhelm the individual and cause emotional harm of some kind and cause a loss of resiliency. This has become critical, this whole issue of resiliency, and I'll get into it a little bit later. So we also said there are different forms of trauma. Trauma can occur from a natural disaster. It can occur from an accident. It can occur, like the work I do, from interpersonal violence. It can occur from war, from conflict, from workplace violence, from sexual abuse and exploitation, and from family violence and child and elder abuse. It also can occur from different forms of healthcare problems. And you'll see as I go on, we really broaden the definition of working with trauma. So it's more than what it used to be considered. And we hope that that's going to be helpful for the general psychologist. We decided that there are two forms of one is a specialization in trauma, and one is just the average, regular psychological practice person who will come across trauma a lot in their practice as well. And so we tried to divide that into those who are specialized and those who are in a general practice. We looked at some of the possible diagnoses. The ones that we were most concerned about included PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder when it doesn't reach PTSD, complex PTSD when it's even a longer term and more complicated treatment needs, trauma exacerbated psychopathology. So people have primary other diagnoses, but they get exacerbated by experiencing a trauma. Or the same thing for physical health problems. You may have a long-term disorder like perhaps diabetes or like some neurological like Parkinson's diseases, and then experience a trauma, and that exacerbates both the disorder that you have physically, but also mentally. We also looked at secondary trauma, when we called it also compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. And under that category, we began to see some of the intergenerational kinds of trauma that have been experienced, and that a recent trauma might trigger or exacerbate those long-term or intergenerational types of traumas. And then, as I said earlier, we really looked at the loss of resiliency and how so much of the trauma treatment needed to focus on not just healing symptoms, but going and looking at restoring resiliency to deal with other forms of trauma that might occur later on. And so it's a kind of a broadened look at trauma than were in those clinical guidelines, which mostly focused on symptom uh, 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 lessening the symptoms that people have. So as I said, we also separated into two areas that are also in the literature called trauma-informed care and trauma-specific care. Trauma-informed care is what we think would be best practices for all clinicians and forensics psychologists to understand. It's both an intervention and an organizational approach about how trauma may affect an individual's life and his or her response to the kinds of treatment that's being offered to them. There are different definitions of trauma-informed care, but the best one that we felt for a trauma-informed approach incorporated three specific elements. One, that all mental health professionals would do well to recognize the prevalence of trauma, recognize that trauma can affect all individuals with where they're working, whatever kind of work they do, and that to put this knowledge into some kind of practice. Oftentimes, it means setting up the program that you're working in a particular way so as not to re-traumatize people. And we give lots of examples of that throughout the document. Trauma-specific care, on the other hand, is a very specific group of techniques that are designed to deal with the very specific problems that occur from trauma itself. For example, helping people identify their trauma triggers, what exacerbates the trauma, and experiencing it in their mind, and maybe using some techniques like behavioral techniques like desensitization in order to reduce that psychological impact. Or maybe it's using narrative exploration of trauma memories and learning how to do that to help people reduce the impact. Maybe guided imagery. There are a lot of good techniques that are being used for that. And maybe memory consolidation. We talk about some techniques for doing it and some psychopharmacology for doing it. But we don't expect the average clinician to be able to know how to do all of that. Those we would say are more likely for those who are specializing in working with trauma. So these are two important distinctions. So with that, what we have done is we said, okay, what kinds of guidelines can we give? And we broke down what we think people working in trauma, mental health professionals working in trauma, and what areas they would be best practices for them to know about. And we came up with 6 specific areas. The first one is about how you acquire knowledge. I started off talking about the fact that we know that there's so much knowledge out there in the general world, and you need to be familiar with them. You need to know about the kinds of apps that are on the social media pages, because your patients may come in with them, and to know what ones may have scientific backing and what ones may not. What may be culturally appropriate, but may not have a lot of research to back them up. But these are the kinds of things that you would be best practices for mental health professionals to know. And then we give a rationale and application of how to find that out. We wanted to broaden that because we believe that we often get stuck with thinking that the only information that we need to have is what scientists give us as practitioners. We say no, practitioners should really, scientists need to learn from practitioners as well. And we call for more research because we really do need to have more research in some of the areas that we're already working in. We then went on to education as the second area, and we give some guidelines. I think there were 2 or 3 guidelines in the education area that talked about that you need to continue education, not just what you learn in school, but as we know, you need to have continuing professional education, which I'm sure many of you are on this webinar and you know about that. We then took a whole area on legal and regulatory issues. I'm going to talk more about that in a few moments because I don't know whether it would have been done had somebody who wasn't forensically involved chairing this committee, but we believe that the general psychologist ought to know what we're doing with legal and regulatory issues, many of which apply to them. And so they need to know about it. The fourth area is assessment. And again, we talk about various ways of assessing people who come into us who have trauma, making sure you not only assess for trauma reactions when they first come in for treatment or for a forensic evaluation, but to go through it at different times, especially during treatment, because it changes over time. People's perception, people's understanding, people's memory of trauma will change over time. The fifth area is intervention. And of course, we spent a lot of time on what the general psychologist should know about treatment of trauma-informed treatment that they are working with. We also added two subsections here. We talked about psychopharmacology and the knowledge that we think is important, especially in working with trauma, because we know that a lot of the uh, medications that are often prescribed for trauma don't really have good scientific backing on them, but those that are used for memory consolidation as soon as trauma occurs or within a short period of time actually are very helpful. And so we go through some of that. And we talk about some of the newer biological agents that may be used for working with people in trauma. Not that people should be doing it, but should have knowledge about it, so that if you have a client that may be resistant to certain things, there may be alternatives for them that you can use for referral. And we do talk a lot about referral and about consultation. And then the second um, subcategory under intervention are telehealth issues. Here we talk about how telehealth can be used for many of our clients or patients who have trauma and can be used for forensic evaluations um, in, uh, in trauma. But there are specific guidelines that they should be followed and that we should always have some attempts to protect patients if they should be in any kind of difficulty, because we know some of the telehealth is over state lines, and we talk a little bit about those kinds of regulations. And then the last, sixth area are areas that we lump together because we call them special areas of equity. And here we really are looking at what culture and bias has done to impact how people experience trauma. We expanded the definitions as we worked here, and we could have identified, I think, about 30 areas that had been suggested to us. Obviously, we couldn't do guidelines with that many. We already had about 100 pages in our document, but we picked 4 areas that we thought would be important for the general psychologist to know about. The first is, we called it health equity, and this is what we learned during COVID, that people are not all having equal access to be able to um, uh, get health care, and that can cause trauma itself. Of course, COVID caused a lot of trauma to a lot of people because of its unknown. We went through it together, well, none of us knowing what was going to be the future. And so we talked a little bit about how to work within the issues of health equity. We then talked about racial and intergenerational trauma. Here we really looked a lot at during our time that we were doing this, was the all the police and racial issues around police bias against African American people. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the kinds of racial trauma, and a lot of it is intergenerational. We talked a little bit about epigenetics, and I'm fascinated with the area. that especially also with Jewish trauma and the trauma from pogroms and intergenerational trauma, that now is coming up and working with many Jewish patients since the October 7th massacre and the subsequent war and the hostilities on campuses that are really giving a lot of students a lot of psychological difficulty. We then added intergenerational trauma. And here we could have picked battered woman syndrome, which of course is the area that I do my work in. But instead, we picked the sexual harassment area for two reasons. One is because it's very common or more common in workplace areas. And we wanted to really talk about the different areas and applications, but also because we had a number of military psychologists on our task force, and they are really doing a lot of work on sexual harassment within the military. And so we wanted to honor that as well. And then the fourth area is an area that's really starting to get a lot of more of attention in the mental health field, and that's immigration and refugee trauma, trauma that occurs for how immigrants are treated and how traumatic escaping a country that may be at war or a reason for whatever reason for becoming refugees and leaving their country and coming to a new country, sometimes with a whole new language as well as culture. And so these are the areas that we chose. We have 16 guidelines, a few in each area. And you can read it. I think it's going to be posted shortly on it's not quite up on the APA website yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be up there within the next month. So let me turn now. I'm going to check for a minute to see if there's any questions. I can't see that here. Let me see. I have to.
There are current questions in the Q&A box. You're free to look at those if you want to now, or otherwise I can moderate them for you at the end.
All right, maybe we'll moderate them at the end, if that'll work, unless you think there's something, Anthony, that really should be taken up before I continue, because now I'm going to go into depth in the legal and regulatory frameworks.
I think it's fairly standard for us to hold them to the end, and seeing those, I don't see any that's particularly like the context would be more important now than later on. So I think you could keep going and we can hold them until the end.
Perfect. Okay, we'll do that. So let's look at the three guidelines that we added to the legal and regulatory frameworks area. The first one, which is actually the fourth guideline in the group, is up here. It's psychologists strive to be knowledgeable of the federal and state legal and regulatory frameworks, policies, and procedures that may be relevant to or have implications for working with adults with traumatic stress disorders. And then this includes scope of practice for licensure, which you all should be aware of, mandatory reporting of trauma to children, to older adults, persons with disabilities, or other vulnerabilities, which I'm sure we all are aware of because it's different for each state, and duty to warn or duty to protect, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, those who may pose a risk of harm to themselves or to others. So those are the major ones that we're talking about. But we're saying every general psychologist would do well to know them, that they should strive to do that. And we say the rationale is because you're going to have people who come to you who have trauma, who may need us to do that kind of reporting, or to at least make some considerations about whether it's necessary to do so or not. And that that's going to be more likely in some cases with people who have experienced trauma than others, and the nuances are important. So we talk about some of those within that guideline. I think that many of us have learned them in graduate schools, but we don't go back, especially those of us who were doing forensic work. We don't think that we need to necessarily go back and remember them, but sometimes they change. And so it is important, especially in the whole issue of duty to warn and duty to protect, because those nuances are very different state to state, and they do keep changing. For different states. And so it's good to let yourself become familiar with them. And I would suggest at least once a year when all those guidelines and rules and regulations start to change. Now, the next one under this issue, guideline 5, is that psychologists strive to become knowledgeable about the various types of legal proceedings with which trauma survivors might become involved, including laws and regulations around serving as a forensic expert, as well as the implications of treatment approaches with patients who are justice involved or engaged in other legal proceedings. So here we're really saying that people who have experienced trauma, who come for psychotherapy, may well need certain kinds of psychotherapy that doesn't tamper with their memory. That's basically the area that is most familiar. For example, some forms of treatment, such as something called neurolinguistic programming, tries to change the way you remember something. Well, if somebody's involved in a litigation of any kind, you don't want to do that, because that's going to negate their possibility of recovering for damages. The other possibility, of course, is if you're dealing with justice involved people, you need to be careful that you do not take away their right to remain silent. So you may need to sidestep the work around a particular criminal act that they may be encouraged. So we're trying not to teach forensic psychology, but to teach the general practitioner what kinds of things they need to be aware of if they're working with forensically involved people in any kind of legal proceeding, and that to choose their treatment as well as to choose their assessment approach if you're a forensic psychologist, so that you're not interfering with the other. We also spend some time talking about the difference between a treating therapist and a forensic expert in testimony, because both may be involved. They both may be declared as experts because only the court does. There had been some problems a few years ago with were therapists actually a treating therapist actually an expert? And of course they are. If they're going to give an opinion, a diagnosis is an opinion. How much treatment they need, whether what the prognosis is, may be an opinion. So those kinds of things are opinions, but they're different. They're based on, knowing the client in a particular way, whereas a forensic expert is based on knowing a client at a particular time when we do the testing or the assessment that we do. Treatment, it may be over a period of time. So there are benefits and holes in what people know, depending on what kinds of methodology is being used. And we talk about that. And we talk about the different areas of treatment and what people may be going through. Because in many cases, if you're a treating expert, you really need to know what the person is going through when they're going through treatment. So it's a very different kind of forensic approach than in some of the forensic guidelines, which don't go into the detail that we went into. And then the last guideline in this area is talking about the consulting forensic psychologist. who may really be asked to help um, uh, other professionals in the legal system, attorneys usually or judges, to help answer their legal questions about trauma survivors for which we have scientific knowledge. And so we talk about understanding how forensic psychologists can indeed strive to answer those kinds of legal questions if we have the information to do so. So we've really put in what is usually just clinical guidelines, information that could be helpful for the general practitioner or even somebody who's just getting into forensic work, or maybe even for some who have been in for a while. Some of it certainly I use in my work. Now I'm going to go over a couple of other guidelines that I think may be important for those of us who are working in the forensic field. And I chose to do the assessment guidelines here because there are 3 of them, one of which talks about the use of multiple source of data, including culturally informed sources, when we assess trauma history or the symptoms or how they impact on people's physical, mental health, and psychosocial functioning. And that we do it both during the initial and this ongoing psychological assessment. Guideline 8, we talk about striving to practice with competence and cultural sensitivity, and looking at all kinds of cultural idioms, monitoring people's internal distress, and providing therapeutic support throughout the process. And the 10th, whoops. Yeah, I think I skipped one. Yeah. 7 and 8. Well, I skipped 9, which is also 9, I believe, talks about referral and the ability to refer to others. The intervention had 4 guidelines. Here we have guideline 10, where we say it's a good idea for people to know about trauma-informed care. And, in many places, like the state of Florida has now mandated that any place that gets funds from the state of Florida should, any treatment center should train their staff and set up trauma-informed care. So it's not something unusual, but we're making a point of it, that it's best practices to know about it. And guideline 11 is if you're going to be providing trauma-focused psychotherapy, then know some of the what are some of the more important specific treatment techniques, like we talked about before. And if you don't have them, either get the training or know how to refer. So know your referral sources in your community. And then we also talked about understanding the use of psychopharmacology and other biological agents. And we talked about telehealth. And I want to spend just another few minutes talking about those 4, equity and historical and intergenerational trauma. I just talked about them earlier. Here we talked about barriers to timely health care and the kinds of harm and trauma that can occur when people don't have it. We talked about in guideline 15, the influence of racial, ethnic, and cultural factors on trauma and recovery, and the role of incidents and systemic impression as forms of stress. Under sexual harassment, we did talk about military, law enforcement, and other male-dominated occupations, and how such trauma interacts with the broader context of societal kinds of things, including other forms of interpersonal violence, sexism, racism. And we talked about although we do stress male-dominated occupations because that's what's more familiar in the law, we also talked about the fact that men can be sexually harassed, and in the military, there are cases and treatment guided for men who are being sexually harassed, sometimes by other men, sometimes by women. And then in the last guideline is to look at not only the problems that immigrants and refugees have had, but to really strive to understand both the strengths, their strengths as well, and to help rebuild their resilience. And of course, resilience, I said we would talk about a little bit. We don't really have much time to talk about it, but maybe we'll do another webinar on resilience because I think that's going to be one of the key areas that we need to look at in our trauma treatment and our trauma assessment. We're pretty good at assessing the harm from trauma, but we don't really do a good enough job, I don't think, in most areas of assessing what are the strengths that people have and how do we rebuild what they have, because so many people who have strengths and then are traumatized need that assistance in rebuilding those kinds of strengths because that's how they're going to heal. So with that, I'm going to just conclude by saying I think that if psychologists who follow these professional practice guidelines, we think that they're going to be able to assess and intervene with patients or clients who have experienced trauma so they can help heal from their symptoms and to rebuild their resilience. So with that, I think we'll stop. I gave you a couple of references here that you can look up. And as I said, these guidelines should be produced. They should be up on the website rather quickly because they have them all. And here's your little barcode for those of you who are going to get your CE credits. And I'm going to stop sharing and let's talk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker, Lenore, and going through all of that with us. I see more and more questions pouring in live as we speak right now. If you have any more questions for Dr. Walker, she's able to stay for another 10 minutes to answer some questions.
Sure.
And the APA continuing education link should be posted in the next minute or two in the chat box. So keep your eye on that. Somebody asked as a I guess a holistic wrap question for this overall conversation, how are trauma-informed assessment and psychotherapy different from more general good practices, other than specifically asking about actual or potentially traumatic events?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that you really have to think about making sure that you don't re-traumatize somebody while you're asking the questions. So, for example, if you're talking to somebody who comes in who has been sexually assaulted, you've got to make sure that in the questions that you ask them, it isn't, well, what clothes did you wear, or anything that might hint, not even intentionally, but hint at the possibility that they might have asked for it, as some people might say, you wore something very sexy, so what did you think they would be? So you have to be clear of that in your questioning. You also need to make sure that your setup, your organization where you're working is allowing some safety, so that if somebody was traumatized, for example, I dealt with a client who was sexually assaulted in the bathroom. For her, she wanted somebody to escort her when she had to use the restroom because she was so scared. It produced such anxiety. So while you might want to deal with the anxiety psychologically at some point, you want to be aware that your setup allows you or somebody else to escort to the restroom, or there's a lock on the door so that nobody else can get in except somebody with a key. Or you might want to be sure that you are allowing her to select what time she comes in, so you're not forcing her into a time that she says is not good for her, for whatever reason. Or lights in a parking lot, if you're seeing somebody in the evenings, or having an escort. So these are kinds of things you wouldn't necessarily think about. Not that they're not good practices for everybody, but you might not think about it. For it's especially important not to re-traumatize. So you may have to work with your agency in helping. For example, not saying, no, you have to come in only at this 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, but you could come in 10 o'clock Tuesday morning, or you could come in Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Which would you prefer? So you're giving choices and helping them make choices.
From a conceptual standpoint, someone wanted to see if you could address terminology creep. Adjacent services in court settings see a disproportionate number of clients who self-diagnose PTSD based on relationships with an ex-partner or spouse. From their experience, the label is used in family court custody battles, often with a non-forensic therapist repeating the self-identification.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we do with that. I think our job is to work with the individual, and to make it clear what our opinion is with the individual. Um, uh, we're the experts, and therapists may or may not be expert in that particular area. Family court is a very difficult area to work in. If I give you all my opinions, they'll never hire me ever again, so I won't. But um, the important thing to remember is that um, people who are working in this area, um, really, we need to protect children, and we need to do what's important to protect children. And if we don't know enough about how that should be doing, how we should be doing that, then we shouldn't be doing that work.
Someone asked if you would go a bit more into the challenges for a treating psychologist alleviating trauma, and perhaps altering memories and hopefully alleviating distress, and forensic work understanding the way treatment may have mitigated or alleviating trauma, thus impacting compensation or future treatment needs.
I'm not quite sure. Let's see if we can unpack that question a little bit. I'm not quite sure what somebody is asking.
The timestamp is at 11:50 there.
Is this a question in the chat?
It's in the Q&A box there.
Okay. $11.50. Oh, I have different times. Okay. Okay, I see. Challenges of a treating psychologist alleviating trauma and perhaps altering memories. Okay, and forensic work. Okay. Yeah. All right. I think the answer to that is that it may take a discussion with the client and the client's attorney for the treating therapist to understand what the issues are in the actual litigation. Um, for example, it may be that as a treating therapist, you can do some testing, and you can do some documentation of the damage that the person has when they come in. And then you can do treatment so that they get better and heal, even though the litigation may be pending. So that's one way of handling that kind of a dilemma. In other cases, it may be that the attorney says, no, if this person, they haven't filed the case yet, and if they don't have damage when they file the case, it depends on what the need is at the time that it's occurring. And so only the attorney will know that, and a consultation will be helpful if there's any question about it. But I agree, it is difficult. Sometimes you really want the person to get better, and you know you have the ways of helping them, but it will tamper with memories. And so you have to be careful of that.
From a from a primary prevention perhaps perspective, someone asked how you would recommend preparing staff or debriefing new staff for inpatient psychiatric staff to prepare for working in an environment where there is a high potential for being traumatized in the work setting.
Wow. I think education is going to be the best way of preparing staff for what kinds of things can happen in the work setting, um, so that people can take precautions. For example, in some inpatient settings, we do have some violent patients, and there, I don't particularly work in those settings, but I do know some of my students have gone through training in how to deal with a violent patient. I've trained my students when they go into those settings that if they get the sensation or any kind of belief, it doesn't have to be firm information. It just has to be that it's uh, you know, that you sense that this person is getting agitated, close it down and get out. Protect yourself. Protecting yourself is always most important, and getting help and getting assistance. We actually took students out of one facility where they were taking security off the floor, and we felt that security wouldn't get there fast enough. So these are the kinds of things that we can do. Um, but if a place really is having a lot of problems, then um, I think we need to really try, if you're working there and you're staff there, you need to definitely protect yourself, because that's also protecting the client and not letting the patient get out of control.
We are at the top of the hour. So, Dr. Walker, Lenore, thank you so much for all the work you've done in this area, all your contributions immediately to clients and the field as large, and then sharing all of that information for us here about how we might be able to be working with people that have experienced a number of different types of traumas. Your contributions long term and then immediately today are greatly
Thank,
appreciated. Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much.
And
It's been my
glad you're safe
pleasure.
and clear for now. Yes, keep safe
Okay,
there. And that wraps up this
bye-bye.
week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, we have Dr. David Shapiro, who will be covering some commonly asked questions about forensic mental health practice. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues and behavioral health in the law. Until next time.